On the morning of February 15th, 1990, inside an apartment in Inkster, Michigan, a young woman named Dianne Hood lay dead after a night her neighbors would never be able to forget and maybe never be able to forgive themselves for. She was 23 years old. She had been beaten. She had been strangled. The walls around her had already carried the warning. Voices had risen. A fight had broken open. Screaming had spilled into the night hard enough for other people to hear it through their own doors and their own windows. By sunrise, the noise was gone, the apartment was still, and the woman at the center of it all was dead. Police would focus on the person closest to her, the boyfriend who admitted he'd been there, the man many believed had to know exactly what happened in that room. But belief isn't a conviction, suspicion isn't a charge, and when the case failed to cross that line, Dianne Hood became one more name in the long, cold row of women who seemed to vanish twice, once from life and then again from justice. And if you stay with this story long enough, the part that will get under your skin isn't only what happened to her, but what didn't happen when there was still time. Inkster in 1990 wasn't the kind of place that strangers from far away were writing poems about. It was a working city between Detroit and Dearborn, a place of small apartment complexes, tired streets, winter dark mornings, and the kind of neighborhoods where people knew each other just enough to recognize a voice through a wall. February in Michigan has a way of making everything feel closer and farther at the same time. Windows stay shut. Heat clicks on and off. Conversations next door travel farther than they should. You hear footsteps in a hall, doors open and shut, a television through the plaster, a child crying in another unit, an argument you wish would stop so you can tell yourself it's none of your business. That's the setting Dianne died in. Not out on some isolated back road. Not in a place hidden from witnesses. She died in a home, surrounded by other people. Other ears. Other hands that could have picked up a phone. That detail changes the whole story, because it means the distance between life and death may have been measured not in miles, but in a wall, a hallway, a few minutes, one decision, and one call that never came. Dianne Hood was 23, which is an age that still feels half-built. Old enough to have a serious relationship, a private life, adult problems, adult hopes. Young enough for everything to still be in motion. At 23, people are still becoming themselves. They're still trying out futures. They're still believing, sometimes against their own better judgment, that love can steady things that clearly aren't steady. The public record in cases like this is often cruelly thin. A name, an age, a cause of death, a city, a few lines about who may have been with her. That's all the world often keeps. But a person is never only that. Dianne had routines, tastes, private jokes, little habits no police file can hold. She had reasons she stayed with the people she stayed with. She had fears she may have explained away. She had mornings before this one, and she expected more of them. Then something happened in that apartment that ended all of it, and the hardest part is that it wasn't silent. It announced itself, and still the night was allowed to keep going. The known outline is blunt. Neighbors heard screaming and fighting coming from Dianne's apartment that night. The next morning, she was found dead. She'd been beaten and strangled. Her boyfriend was questioned extensively. He admitted being there that night. He denied killing her. Police suspected the person responsible was someone she knew, and everything about the circumstances points in that direction. There was violence. There was access. There was a confrontation that escalated into something final. Yet without DNA evidence, and without witnesses willing to testify, the case stalled. That phrase can sound almost procedural when you hear it in a summary. No DNA evidence. No witnesses willing to testify. But what that really means is that whatever happened in that room got close enough to leave horror and not enough to leave a prosecutable path. It means the truth may have been shared in whispers after the fact, or locked inside people who were too afraid, too loyal, too broken, or too exhausted to help. It means a woman can die in a burst of violence that other people hear, and the legal system can still end up standing there with empty hands. Try to picture the hours before Dianne was found. Not to turn her death into theater, but to understand how ordinary time can carry something irreversible inside it. It's winter in Michigan. The sky goes dark early. Buildings hold cold in the stairwells. Someone is cooking dinner in another unit. A radio is on somewhere. The night doesn't arrive with a sign that says this is the one that will matter 35 years later. Dianne is in her apartment. Her boyfriend is there too, by his own admission. Maybe the tension started low and familiar, as arguments often do, with a tone more than a word. Maybe it began with a question asked the wrong way. Maybe it was already old business, another round in a fight that had never really ended. Then the volume rises. Chairs scrape. Feet move hard across the floor. There's yelling now, not the kind you tune out, but the kind that makes you stop what you're doing and listen without meaning to. At least one person nearby must have felt that cold little jolt that comes when a domestic fight crosses from unpleasant into dangerous. And still the night kept moving toward morning. That's one of the ugliest truths in cases like Dianne's. Domestic violence often performs itself in public just enough to warn people and not enough to force them. Neighbors hear it. Friends sense it. Relatives hear explanations that don't quite sit right. Everyone gets a fragment. Everyone tells themselves maybe it's not as bad as it sounds. Maybe they'll work it out. Maybe if it gets worse, somebody else will intervene. That's how a woman can end up trapped in a room with a man who has already pushed past the line, while the people around her wait for certainty, as if certainty ever arrives before harm. The scream through the wall is already certainty. The sound of something hitting the floor is already certainty. The crash, the pleading, the sudden silence after chaos, those are all forms of certainty too. But human beings are experts at delaying action when action might be awkward, risky, embarrassing, or involve the police. That doesn't make the neighbors killers. It does leave a wound in the story that never quite closes, because once Dianne was found, everybody knew the sound from the night before had meant exactly what they feared. The title attached to this case says it cleanly and cruelly. Neighbors heard her screaming. No one called for help. That sentence doesn't just describe a missed opportunity. It defines the emotional center of the murder. If Dianne had died in complete isolation, the grief would be one shape. But she didn't. Her last known hours unfolded within reach of other people. That knowledge changes the weight carried by everyone who heard something and did nothing. Maybe they froze. Maybe they'd heard arguments before and thought this was another one. Maybe they were scared of retaliation. Maybe they believed the fight would burn itself out. Maybe they thought it wasn't their place. Those explanations may all be true, and none of them would have mattered to Dianne if she was fighting for breath in the next room. That's the unbearable part. In the minutes when life narrows to pure survival, social discomfort and neighborhood caution become luxuries. The person being attacked doesn't need your certainty. She needs your interruption, and in Dianne's case, that interruption never came. The boyfriend sits at the center of the suspicion for obvious reasons. He was there that night. He admitted that much, and neighbors heard a violent argument in the apartment where Dianne was later found beaten and strangled. Police questioned him extensively, which tells you they understood what the circle around Dianne likely understood too. In cases involving intimate partner violence, the most dangerous person in the room is often the one the victim already knows, already loves in some complicated way, already makes excuses for, already fears upsetting, already believes she can calm if she just says the right thing. Violence in relationships rarely appears from nowhere. It grows through smaller permissions. Control disguised as concern. Anger explained away as stress. Jealousy mistaken for devotion. The bad night becomes the worst night, and by the time somebody on the outside realizes what's been building, the person inside the relationship has been living with it for months or years. We don't know every chapter of Dianne's relationship. What we do know is that when the night ended, she was dead and her boyfriend was the man who had been with her. He denied killing her. That denial has hung over the case ever since. There's a peculiar frustration in cases where the suspected person isn't a phantom or a stranger, but someone right there in the frame from day one. It creates a kind of unfinished pressure. People don't ask who might have done it in the broad, abstract sense. They ask why the man who admitted being there wasn't charged. They ask what police had and what they lacked. They ask whether the truth was known in human terms, but not in legal ones. That distinction matters more than most people realize. There are cases where suspicion settles heavily in one direction, but the criminal justice system can't turn that suspicion into a case a prosecutor believes will survive. Without physical evidence tying the suspect directly to the fatal act, without a witness who saw the final minutes, without a statement that amounts to an admission, the whole thing can freeze. Dianne's file seems to live in that frozen space, where people feel they understand the shape of the crime, but can't prove the hands that carried it out. Beating and strangulation are deeply personal forms of violence. They require contact, force, control, and time. Strangulation in particular is not the act of a person who is emotionally absent from what he's doing. It is close. It is intimate in the most terrible sense of that word. It means the killer is there for the struggle, there for the panic, there for the exact moment when a human body gives out. When Dianne's cause of death is described that way, beaten and strangled, it tells you this was not a distant act. There was no emotional buffer of a weapon fired from across a room. The killer used his own body as the mechanism of control. That's one reason police likely looked so hard at the boyfriend. Crimes of that kind often grow out of rage, possession, humiliation, rejection, or some mix of all of them. They happen in rooms where emotion has already boiled over. They happen after accusations, after threats, after the point where one person decides the other no longer gets to leave, speak, resist, or continue. The apartment itself would have held that evidence in the air the next morning. Imagine the scene when Dianne was found. The apartment that had carried all that sound the night before is now still, too still, the kind of stillness that feels wrong as soon as you step into it. The air is stale from a closed winter room. Furniture sits in the awkward positions left by a struggle. Maybe something is overturned. Maybe there are marks that show where force changed the shape of the space. The violence has stopped, but it hasn't gone anywhere. It stays in the room, in the pressure of silence after noise, in the fact that the person who screamed hours earlier cannot answer back now. Police arrive to the aftermath of an argument they did not hear, a sequence they have to reconstruct from physical clues and frightened recollections. Every detective on a scene like that knows the first hours matter. Who was there? Who left? What neighbors heard? Whether anyone saw someone come or go. Whether the suspect's version fits the room. But early urgency can only do so much if people hold back, if fear settles over the complex, if no one wants to be the one who points a finger and then lives with the consequences. And that's another brutal layer here. The case details say there were no witnesses willing to testify. Not no witnesses at all. No witnesses willing to testify. That wording suggests knowledge existed near the edges of the case. Maybe someone heard more than they later admitted. Maybe someone saw the boyfriend arrive or leave in a state that mattered. Maybe there were statements made in private that never hardened into courtroom testimony. Fear can rot a case from the inside long before trial. People fear retaliation. They fear getting tangled in police work. They fear being wrong. They fear being labeled a snitch. They fear the suspect or the suspect's family, or simply the endless obligation that comes once your name goes on paper. Whatever the reason, the effect is the same. A dead woman waits for justice while the living protect themselves. That may sound harsh, but murder is harsh. And one of the most painful facts in unsolved cases is how often the missing piece isn't hidden in a lab, but sitting inside somebody's chest. Inkster in 1990 was not untouched by the pressures that make witness cooperation hard. Working-class communities often carry complicated histories with law enforcement. People may believe police won't protect them after they talk. They may believe the system cares less about women hurt behind closed doors than it should. They may have their own legal troubles, their own reasons to avoid official attention, their own history of seeing cases come and go without anything improving. None of that excuses silence. It does explain why silence survives. If a woman's scream in the night isn't enough to break through those layers, then by the time a detective shows up with a notepad the next day, asking careful questions under fluorescent kitchen light, the moment has already begun to harden. People start simplifying what they heard. They trim the edges off their memory. They describe it as just arguing, just yelling, just another domestic dispute. The law needs detail. Fear erases detail first. And that may be one reason Dianne's killer, or the man many believe killed her, walked away from that apartment without an arrest. There's also the sad, familiar pattern of how society hears violence against women when it comes through apartment walls. If the sound is a gunshot, people recognize emergency. If the sound is a crash and a woman crying with a man shouting over her, too many people file it mentally under private business. Domestic violence has long been granted a kind of cover that other violence doesn't get. We dress it up in relationship language. Lovers quarrel, rough patch, couple fighting. We turn active danger into background noise. That backgrounding may have been fatal for Dianne. Somewhere close by, someone likely sat in a chair, turned down a television, listened, and waited for the noise to pass because that felt easier than getting involved. By the next day, easy had turned permanent. Cases like this force a question most people would rather avoid. How many killings begin with sounds that multiple people recognize as wrong and survive only because everybody assumes somebody else will be the brave one? The date matters too. Mid-February, the part of winter when the cold has lost its novelty and become a burden. The streets are gray. The daylight is short. Bills pile up. Relationships strain under ordinary pressures and private ones. There's a cruel irony in the way this murder sits near Valentine's Day, a season wrapped in the language of romance, while one young woman likely spent her final hours inside, the violent opposite of it. Whatever feelings were moving through that apartment, they were not love, no matter what anyone may have called them afterward. Possession isn't love. Control isn't love. Jealous rage isn't love. Putting your hands on someone's body and refusing to stop when they cry, fight back, or beg is not passion. It's violence. Dianne's story belongs to a long, painful archive of women killed by men who stood close enough to claim them, who knew them well enough to enter their homes, who could be inside one moment and deny everything the next. The distance between intimacy and danger is one of the central terrors of this case, and it never stops mattering. What did the boyfriend say when police questioned him? Public summaries don't give us a transcript, and maybe that absence is its own kind of torment. Somewhere in an interview room or across a detective's desk, he had to account for the last night of Dianne Hood's life. He admitted he was there. That alone would have made investigators lean and hard. Did he say the argument happened and he left her alive? Did he try to minimize the fight? Did he place the timing in a narrow window that could still allow some unknown intruder to slip through? Did he act wounded, angry, calm, rehearsed? We don't know. But detectives questioned him extensively, which means they saw a reason to press. They didn't glance past him. They didn't treat him as incidental. They worked him as a probable answer. Yet probable answers are not always chargeable answers. That's a hard lesson in homicide work. People think the biggest challenge is finding the right suspect. Sometimes the biggest challenge comes after that, when you found the person you can't stop looking at and still can't force the case over the line. Without DNA evidence, the case was always going to lean heavily on testimony, timeline, and pressure. DNA has become the public symbol of certainty in criminal cases, but in 1990 and long after, many investigations had to move without it or with biological evidence too weak, too compromised, or too incomplete to matter in court. In a beating and strangulation inside an apartment shared by a victim and someone she knew, the evidentiary landscape can get muddy fast. The suspect has an innocent explanation for his presence. His fingerprints don't prove murder. His being in the apartment isn't disputed. If there are signs of struggle, the defense can call it a fight short of homicide. If there are bruises, the defense can argue timing. If there are no outside witnesses to the final act, prosecutors start seeing risk everywhere. A not guilty verdict can close doors that an unsolved status keeps cracked open. So sometimes a case lingers in that limbo, with police convinced, a community half convinced, and the law unwilling to bet everything on a trial it might lose. That may be the legal logic. For Dianne, it still means no justice. The apartment building itself becomes almost like a silent character in a case like this. Buildings remember in the way people do. For a while after a violent death, every tenant who stays on carries some version of the memory. The hallway where police stood. The door everybody stared at. The unit nobody wanted to walk past alone. The patch of parking lot where neighbors clustered in coats. arms folded tight against the cold, speaking low because death had suddenly moved in among the mailboxes and concrete steps. Someone would have cleaned the apartment eventually. Somebody else may have rented it. Fresh paint can cover a wall, but it can't remove what people know happened inside. Maybe there were tenants who later said they should have called. Maybe there were ones who insisted the screaming didn't sound different from other arguments they'd heard before. Maybe some avoided talking about it all, because once you admit you heard enough to worry, you also admit you heard enough to act. That's one of the reasons this case stays so heavy. The evidence didn't vanish into some distant wilderness. It stayed embedded in memory, and memory is a bad witness when guilt is involved. Dianne's age keeps returning because it should. 23 is young in a way that becomes more painful the older you get. At 23, you don't think of yourself as fragile. You think you've already made it through enough to handle what's in front of you. You think arguments end. You think apologies mean something. You think you still have time to correct your choices, leave a bad relationship, move apartments, start over, be smarter next month than you were this month. Many women who die in intimate partner violence cases die inside that ordinary belief in more time. They are not living every day as if they're on the edge of being killed. They are living in the messy middle where danger mixes with hope and familiarity. That may have been true for Dianne too. Whatever she feared during that argument, she may not have believed it would end in death until it was too late. People on the outside like to ask why women stay. The more honest question is why violent men are allowed so many chances to become fatal before anyone stops them. If Dianne had survived that night, how would it have been remembered? Maybe as a bad fight, the last straw, the story she told a friend days later with her hands shaking over coffee. Maybe as the night she finally left him. Maybe as an incident the neighbors gossiped about for a week and then forgot. Survival would have turned the event into warning. Death turned it into evidence. That shift matters because it reveals how much our culture undervalues non-fatal violence. If a woman is slammed into a wall and lives, people often treat it as a private crisis, a relationship problem, something to work out or escape. If she dies, everyone suddenly understands it was serious. Dianne's case lives in that cruel gap. The screaming was already enough. The fighting was already enough. The fear in that apartment was already enough. Waiting for the body is what failed her. And once a system or a neighborhood trains itself to wait for bodies before taking women seriously, it becomes part of the machinery that makes murder possible. There's something especially haunting about the absence of a witness willing to testify, because it leaves open the possibility that the final truth has been circulating in private for decades. Maybe someone was told more than they ever repeated publicly. Maybe after the funeral, after the police interviews, after the first wave of attention faded, there were conversations in cars, on porches, in bars, in kitchens where people said what they really thought happened. Communities often know more than case files show. Not enough to convict, maybe, but enough to shape the local memory. The boyfriend's name may have lingered in that way, attached to the murder in people's minds even as the law remained officially unresolved. That kind of unofficial knowing is both powerful and worthless. Powerful because it keeps the suspicion alive. Worthless because it doesn't put handcuffs on anyone or speak for the dead in court. Dianne's story may have lived for years in that maddening space where everybody nods when the case comes up, and yet nothing moves. Cold cases built around intimate partner violence are often among the most emotionally frustrating because the suspect pool is small, the motive seems painfully understandable, and the barriers to prosecution are stubbornly human. People don't like to testify against men they know. Family members divide. Friends reconsider their statements. The victim cannot explain the history herself. There may be prior arguments, but no police reports, bruises, but no photographs, fear, but no paper trail. Then years pass. Evidence grows stale. Witnesses die or disappear. Memory blurs. The suspect ages into ordinary respectability, at least on the surface, while the victim stays the age she was killed. That visual imbalance is hard to shake. Dianne remains 23 forever. The man police suspected, if he was indeed the killer, got the one thing she did in time. Time to deny. Time to outlast the case. time to let uncertainty protect him. That asymmetry is one reason cold cases like this never really settle. The murder is over. The unfairness keeps happening. You can almost feel the detective's frustration in the Bear case summary. Extensively questioned, never charged. Those two phrases belong together like clenched teeth. They suggest hours of work, follow-up, inconsistencies maybe, pressure maybe, hope maybe, and then the dead stop at the end of the road. A detective can believe something with his whole mind and still not have a case a prosecutor will sign off on. That's one of the most difficult realities for the public to accept. We want justice to be a straight line from suspicion to arrest to conviction. Real life isn't. Real life contains rooms full of smoke where no one wrote down what they saw. Real life contains victims whose final fights were heard but not recorded. Real life contains suspects smart enough to admit what can't be denied and deny what matters most. Real life contains communities that close ranks, not always out of malice, sometimes just out of exhaustion or fear. Dianne's file probably holds all those frustrations in compressed form, and every unsolved year adds another layer on top. Think of Dianne's family for a moment, because their experience is the part least visible in short case descriptions. A homicide doesn't arrive as a clean fact. It arrives as a rupture, a phone call, officers at the door, a sentence that changes the structure of time. Then comes the strange march of procedures that feels almost obscene in its normality. Identification, questions, funeral plans, clothing, paperwork, reporters maybe, detectives asking about the boyfriend, about the relationship, about prior incidents, about whether she was afraid. Families of murdered women often have to learn terrible things about what their loved one was living through, while also absorbing the fact that they'll never get another conversation with her. And when the suspected killer isn't charged, grief gets pinned to uncertainty. You don't even get the brutal clarity of a trial. You get years of hearing the same answer in different words. They think they know, but they can't prove it. That kind of answer does not soothe. It corrodes. There's also the matter of how quickly a murdered woman's life can shrink in public memory to the crime scene itself. Dianne becomes the woman from the apartment in Inkster, the woman whose neighbors heard her scream, the woman with the boyfriend police suspected. Those details are true, but they're not the whole of a human life. One of the quiet violences of unsolved cases is that the victim's identity gets pinned forever to the worst night she ever had. No later chapters arrive to push against that. There is no middle age, no reinvention, no telling of her own story in her own voice. So people who care about these cases are left doing a different kind of work. Not just arguing for justice, but insisting on personhood. Dianne was not born to be an example of ignored warning signs. She was not put on earth to become a paragraph in a cold case roundup. She was a young woman who should have gotten older. That fact sounds simple until you really sit with it, and then it becomes almost unbearable. The line about no one calling for help keeps circling back because it should unsettle us. Not as a cheap moral lesson, but as a mirror. Most people like to imagine they would act if they heard a woman screaming next door. Most people tell themselves they would call 911, bang on the wall, get other neighbors, do something. Yet history is full of cases that prove hesitation is common. People look for certainty, permission, backup, proof that the fear in their own body is justified. They don't want to misread. They don't want to escalate. They don't want trouble. But violent men rely on that hesitation more than we like to admit. They rely on the privacy granted to couples, on the way other people lower their eyes and turn up their televisions. Dianne's death asks a hard question that never stops being current. What does it say about us that a woman can scream within earshot of help and still die alone? The answer is bigger than Inkster, bigger than 1990, and maybe that's why the case still lands so hard. When police suspect a boyfriend in a murder case, the public sometimes divides into easy camps. One camp says they obviously know he did it, and just can't say so. The other camp says if they had the right guy, there would have been charges. Reality is often messier. Investigators may have been convinced, but unable to box the case tightly enough. The boyfriend may have had a story that fit just enough around the edges. The forensic limitations of the time may have left too much room for reasonable doubt. Witnesses may have retreated when the stakes became real. All of that can be true at once. The result is a file that feels emotionally solved and legally unsolved, which is one of the most infuriating states a homicide can exist in. Dianne's case seems to sit exactly there. Her death points in a direction. The system stared in that direction for a long time. And still, no arrest came. That absence becomes part of the story, not just as a legal detail, but as a second injury inflicted after the first. As the years passed, Dianne joined the ranks of the cold cases that don't get national specials every season but never fully disappear either. Cases like hers survive in databases, local newspaper archives, brief cold case features, and the memories of people who lived near them. Sometimes they reappear because a detective reviews old files. Sometimes because a family member keeps pushing. Sometimes because a reporter writes about the women who were heard, harmed, and then left behind by the machinery of proof. Each retelling serves a purpose. It resists erasure. It says this woman is still waiting to be accounted for. It also keeps pressure, however small, on the possibility that someone might talk. The passage of time can loosen people. Loyalty fades. Fear changes shape. Regret grows sharper with age. A person who stayed silent at 25 may feel differently at 60. A neighbor who told herself she didn't hear enough may, after decades, be unable to stop hearing exactly what she heard. Cold cases are built not only on evidence, but on the hope that conscience is slower than fear. If there was one moment when Dianne's fate might have changed, it may not have been in the final physical struggle. It may have been earlier, at the first crash, the first scream, the first stretch of argument that sounded wrong enough to raise the hair on someone's arms in the next unit. That's hard to sit with because it places possibility in ordinary hands. Not detectives, not prosecutors, not advanced science, just neighbors, a phone, a choice. We can never know for sure whether a call would have saved her. Police might have arrived too late. The violence may already have gone too far. But uncertainty cuts both ways. You can't prove she would have lived, and you can't prove she wouldn't have. That unknown becomes a permanent ache in the story. Whenever a case leaves behind a plausible intervention point, people revisit it forever. What if someone had called? What if officers had knocked while she was still alive? What if the fight had been interrupted long enough for him to leave, long enough for her to lock the door, long enough for morning to come without murder? And there's the final bitter truth. Even where a suspect seems obvious, the dead woman often ends up carrying the burden of the gaps. Her life gets examined. Her choices get replayed. Her relationship gets scrutinized. People ask why she was with him, why she let him in, why there was fighting, why no one saw it coming sooner. The man at the center of suspicion gets to sit behind denial, while the woman who cannot answer is dissected. Dianne can't tell us what she feared, what she planned, whether she was already trying to leave, whether she thought this would be the last argument or just another one. She can't clarify any of it. That silence makes it easy for other people to project stories onto her. But the simplest story is usually the truest in cases like this. A young woman was with a man she knew. Neighbors heard violence. By morning, she was dead. He admitted being there. He denied killing her. The law stopped there. Morally, most people never did. What remains now is the shape of a night that still asks something from the living. Dianne Hood was 23 years old when she was found beaten and strangled in her Inkster apartment on February 15, 1990. Neighbors heard screaming and fighting the night before. Her boyfriend admitted he had been there. Police questioned him extensively, but never charged him. Without DNA evidence and without witnesses willing to testify, the case stayed open and unresolved. Those are the facts. But facts alone don't hold the full weight of this story. The full weight lives in the silence after the screams, in the apartment walls that carried warning, in the neighbors who may still remember the sound, in the detectives who couldn't close the gap, and in the possibility that Dianne died within reach of help that never arrived. That's why the case lingers. Not only because a killer may have escaped justice, but because the night gave everyone a chance to understand what was happening, and by the time morning made it undeniable, Dianne Hood was already gone.